when hope was reborn. The bitter February wind cut through downtown Toronto like a knife, carrying with it the scent of exhaust fumes and the distant promise of snow. Michael Chen pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders as he walked past the gleaming towers of Bay Street, their windows reflecting a world that seemed increasingly out of reach. At 32, Michael had once been the kind of person who belonged in those towers. A software engineer with a steady job, a small but comfortable apartment in Scarborough, and dreams of eventually buying a house, maybe even starting a family. That was before the layoffs hit the tech sector in late 2023, before his savings evaporated faster than morning frost on concrete, and before his landlord raised the rent by 40%, pricing him out of the only home he'd known for 5 years. Now, 3 months later, Michael found himself among the statistics he'd once read about with detached sympathy. One of Toronto's estimated 8,000 homeless individuals, carrying everything he owned in a backpack that had seen better days. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years writing code to solve problems, only to find himself facing a problem that seemed to have no algorithmic solution. "Excuse me, sir, do you have any change?" The voice belonged to an elderly woman sitting outside the Eaton Centre, her weathered hands clutching a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps. God bless." Her name was Margaret, Michael had learned over the past weeks. She'd been on the streets for 2 years after her pension proved insufficient to cover both medication and rent. Michael reached into his pocket, finding only lint and the last $2 he'd earned from returning bottles. Without hesitation, he handed the coins to Margaret. "It's not much, but every kindness matters, dear," Margaret interrupted, her eyes crinkling with genuine warmth despite the harsh cold. "The Lord sees every act of love, no matter how small." As Michael continued walking, Margaret's words echoed in his mind. Faith had once been important to him. Sunday services with his grandmother, prayers before meals, the comforting belief that everything happened for a reason. But recent months had tested that faith to its breaking point. How could a loving God allow good people to suffer like this? The shelter where Michael had been staying was a converted community center in the East End, its gymnasium filled with rows of cots that housed the overflow from the city's overwhelmed emergency housing system. With only 2,000 permanent shelter beds for Toronto's homeless population, hundreds of people were turned away nightly. Tonight, as he approached the familiar building, he noticed a commotion near the entrance. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, stood arguing with a security guard while clutching a small child bundled in a threadbare blanket. "Please, we just need somewhere warm to sleep," she pleaded, her accent carrying traces of Eastern Europe. "My daughter, she's been coughing all day. She needs to get warm." Without fully understanding why, Michael approached the group. "Excuse me," he said to the guard, then turned to the woman. "I have a spot inside. Your daughter can have my bed tonight." The woman's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. Her name was Anya, and she'd fled domestic violence with her daughter Sophia. As Michael helped them get settled, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose beyond his own survival. Later that night, as he walked the streets looking for warmth, Michael found himself thinking about his grandmother's favorite Bible verse. "And whoever gives one of these little ones even a cup of cold water because he is a disciple, truly I say to you, he will by no means lose his reward." Matthew 10:42. For the first time in months, Michael began to wonder if perhaps his current circumstances weren't just meaningless suffering, but possibly preparation for something he couldn't yet understand. The morning came grey and harsh, with temperatures dropping to -15 Celsius. Michael had spent the night in a 24-hour Tim Hortons on Yonge Street, nursing a single coffee while dozing off intermittently in a corner booth. His body ached from the uncomfortable position, but he was grateful to have escaped the worst of the cold. Around dawn, he made his way back to the shelter to check on Anya and Sophia. The little girl's cough had worsened overnight, and Anya looked desperate as she tried to comfort her daughter while balancing her on her hip. "The nurse says Sophia needs to see a doctor," Anya explained, her English strained with worry. "But I don't know how to get to hospital. I don't have money for transit, and she's too sick to walk far." Michael thought of his empty pockets, then remembered something. "Wait here," he said, heading toward the shelter's main office. Inside, he found Janet, a social worker he'd spoken with before, a woman in her 50s who dedicated her career to helping Toronto's most vulnerable population. "Janet, there's a sick child who needs medical attention," Michael explained urgently. "Her mother doesn't have transit fare, and the little girl has a fever." Without hesitation, Janet reached into her personal purse and handed Michael $10. "This should cover their bus fare to the nearest hospital. Tell the mother to mention that she's homeless. They have programs to help with costs." As Michael returned with the money, he found Anya crying quietly while Sophia lay listless in her arms. "I don't understand this place," Anya whispered. "In my country, if you have nothing, people ignore you. But here, strangers help strangers. Why would you give up your bed? Why would that woman give money?" The question lingered in Michael's mind as he helped them navigate the TTC system to reach Toronto General Hospital. During the bus ride, Sophia's small hand reached out and grasped his finger, her fever-bright eyes looking up at him with complete trust. The gesture hit him harder than any of his own hardships had. At the hospital, they encountered Dr. Sarah Kim, a pediatric resident who looked exhausted from her overnight shift but gave Sophia her complete attention. When she learned about their housing situation, she not only treated Sophia's respiratory infection but connected them with a family housing program that could provide temporary accommodation. "You know," Dr. Kim said quietly to Michael as they waited for Sophia's prescription, "I see a lot of families in crisis. What you did, giving up your shelter space, that kind of compassion is rare, even among people who have everything." Walking back through downtown Toronto, Michael noticed things he'd never seen before, despite months on these same streets. The way strangers occasionally dropped coins into Margaret's cup. The volunteer at the streetcar stopped handing out hot coffee and sandwiches. The security guard at a bank who let people warm up in the lobby during harsh weather, pretending not to notice their obvious homelessness. Acts of kindness were happening everywhere, small miracles that kept people alive and hope flickering. Perhaps, Michael thought, he'd been so focused on his own fall from grace that he'd missed the grace that surrounded him daily. That evening, as he prepared for another night of uncertainty, Michael found himself in Queen's Park. The provincial legislature building loomed above him, its lights reflecting off the snow-covered ground. For the first time in months, he felt compelled to pray, not the desperate bargaining he'd been doing, but something deeper. "I don't understand what's happening to me," he whispered into the cold air, "but if there's a purpose in this, help me see it." The next week brought news that shattered what little hope Michael had been rebuilding. The community center that housed the emergency shelter announced it would be closing for renovations that would take at least 3 months to complete, with temperatures forecast to remain below freezing for weeks. The closure felt like a death sentence for many. Michael watched as panic spread through the shelter population. Margaret, the elderly woman from outside the Eaton Center, broke down crying when she heard the news. "I can't survive another winter on the streets," she sobbed. "I'm 73 years old. My body can't take it anymore." The city promised alternative arrangements, but everyone knew the reality. There simply weren't enough beds. Toronto's shelter system was already operating at 200% capacity, with people sleeping on gymnasium floors and in hallway cots. The math was brutally simple. Too many people, too few spaces, and winter showed no mercy. That same day, Michael received another blow. His smartphone, his last connection to potential employment opportunities, was stolen while he dozed in the library. Without it, he couldn't receive calls from temp agencies, couldn't access email, couldn't even use the apps that helped locate available shelter beds. The digital divide that separated the housed from the unhoused had just become an unbridgeable chasm. As he sat in Allen Gardens, watching other homeless individuals prepare makeshift shelters among the trees, Michael felt something inside him crack. The accumulated weight of months of rejection letters, closed doors, and diminishing possibilities pressed down on him like the grey February sky. This is it, he thought. This is how it ends. He'd read the statistics. Homeless individuals in Canada died at rates 7 to 8 times higher than the general population. Winter claimed the most vulnerable first: the elderly, the sick, those without adequate shelter. He thought of Margaret's tears, of little Sophia's trusting eyes, of all the people he'd met who deserved so much better than this system that had failed them. For a moment, a dark thought crossed his mind. It would be easy to simply stop fighting, to let the cold take him during one of those long nights when sleep became indistinguishable from something more permanent. At least then, the pain would stop. But then he remembered Anya's question from the hospital. Why would strangers help strangers? He thought of Janet reaching into her own purse without hesitation, of Dr. Kim staying late to help a homeless family, of his own grandmother, who had always insisted that every person was precious in God's eyes. Even Margaret, despite her own desperation, shared her spare change with newcomers to the streets. Even Anya, fleeing violence with nothing but her daughter, had offered to help other mothers in the shelter. Even in the depths of systemic failure and personal catastrophe, people continued to choose love over despair. Standing up from the bench, Michael made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of surrendering to hopelessness, he would use whatever time he had left to help others. If the system was broken, if the math didn't add up, if winter was coming for all of them, then at least he would face it while making sure no one faced it alone. He spent that afternoon visiting every person he'd met on the streets, sharing information about warming centers, connecting people with resources, and simply listening to their stories. By evening, he'd helped an elderly veteran access emergency housing, connected a young Indigenous woman with cultural support services, and convinced 3 people to seek medical attention for conditions they'd been ignoring. As darkness fell over Toronto, Michael found himself back at Queen's Park. The legislature building's lights seemed dimmer tonight, or perhaps his vision was blurred by exhaustion and unshed tears. "I don't know if you're listening," he said aloud, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "But if you are, I need you to know I'm not giving up on these people, even if you've given up on us." That night, Toronto was hit by the worst blizzard of the winter. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, driven by winds that made the already dangerous cold feel lethal. Emergency warming centers opened their doors, but many were already at capacity. Michael spent the evening helping to guide people to any available shelter, his jacket soaked through, his fingers numb beyond feeling. Around midnight, he encountered an elderly Indigenous man named Joseph, sitting in a doorway on Queen Street West, refusing to move despite the worsening storm. "I've been on these streets for 12 years, Joseph said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "If this is how it ends, then so be it. I'm tired of fighting." Michael knelt beside him, recognizing the look in Joseph's eyes, the same despair he'd felt earlier that day. "I know," Michael said simply. "I felt the same way a few hours ago. But then I realized something. Maybe we're not meant to fight for ourselves anymore. Maybe we're meant to fight for each other." "Easy words from a young man," Joseph replied, but his tone held curiosity rather than dismissal. "Come with me," Michael said. "There's a 24-hour McDonald's 2 blocks from here. Let's get warm, and I'll tell you about a little girl named Sophia who reminded me what courage looks like." As they walked through the swirling snow, Michael shared the stories of the people he'd met. Anya's determination to protect her daughter, Margaret's unwavering faith despite her circumstances, Janet's daily choice to care for strangers. By the time they reached the restaurant, Joseph was listening intently. Inside the McDonald's, they found 12 other people who had sought refuge from the storm. The manager, a woman named Rosa, had unofficially opened the dining area as an emergency shelter, providing free coffee and allowing people to stay as long as needed. "My grandmother was homeless once," she explained to Michael when he thanked her. "No one should freeze to death in a city this wealthy." As the hours passed, something remarkable began to happen. The group of strangers started talking to each other, sharing stories, pooling resources, and looking out for one another. Joseph, despite his earlier despair, began mentoring a young man who had recently aged out of foster care. Margaret arrived with 2 other elderly women, having convinced them to leave their dangerous outdoor hiding spots. Michael watched in amazement as the artificial warmth of the fast food restaurant became filled with genuine human warmth. These were people society had written off, yet they were taking care of each other with a tenderness and dignity that challenged every stereotype. Around 4 a.m., as the storm began to subside, Michael stepped outside for a moment. The snow had transformed the familiar cityscape into something ethereal and beautiful. Streetlights created halos in the falling snow, and the usual harsh edges of urban life had been softened into curves and gentle slopes. Standing there in the quiet aftermath of the storm, Michael felt a presence he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming, more like a gentle certainty settling over his heart. In the midst of the city's worst winter storm, surrounded by people society had abandoned, he had witnessed something that felt distinctly divine. Perfect love, casting out fear. "I see it now," he whispered to the falling snow. "You're not in the buildings or the systems or the policies. You're in the people who choose love when hate would be easier. You're in the grandmother who shares her last dollar. You're in the mother who protects her child. You're in the manager who opens her doors." For the first time since his fall from stability, Michael felt something other than fear about the future. He didn't know where he would sleep tomorrow night, or if he would find work, or how long his body could endure the streets. But he knew with absolute certainty that he was not alone, not just because of the people around him, but because of a presence that had been there all along, working through ordinary people doing extraordinary things. When he returned inside, Joseph looked up at him with knowing eyes. "You felt it too, didn't you?" the older man asked quietly. Michael nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, something new had been born. Not just in Michael's heart, but in the connections between all these unlikely souls who had found each other in the darkness. "What happens now?" asked the young man Joseph had been mentoring. Michael looked around at the faces illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights, each one beautiful, each one valuable, each one carrying both scars and hope. "Now we remember this," he said finally. "We remember that love is always possible, even when everything else fails." The days following the blizzard brought an unexpected development. Word had spread about the impromptu community that had formed at Rosa's McDonald's, and local news stations picked up the story. Suddenly, Michael found himself thrust into an unfamiliar role as an unofficial spokesperson for Toronto's homeless community. "We're not asking for handouts," he explained to a CBC reporter standing outside the Eaton Centre where Margaret maintained her familiar post. "We're asking for what everyone deserves: dignity, opportunity, and the chance to contribute. These are good people facing impossible circumstances." The interview aired during the evening news, and the response was immediate. Michael's phone, replaced through a donation program Rosa had connected him with, rang constantly with offers of help, employment opportunities, and interview requests. But what surprised him most was how the attention affected the entire network of people he'd come to know on the streets. Janet, the social worker, called him with excitement. "Michael, 3 companies have contacted our office asking specifically about helping homeless individuals find employment. They saw your interview and want to create transition programs." Dr. Sarah Kim reached out as well. "The hospital administration wants to formalize our homeless outreach program. Would you be willing to help us understand what services would actually make a difference?" But it was Margaret who provided the most profound insight. "Dear boy," she said, as they shared coffee outside the Tim Hortons where Michael had spent that first homeless night. "Do you see what's happening? You started by giving away your bed to a stranger, and now strangers are giving you opportunities. This is how grace works. It multiplies." Michael had been offered 3 job interviews, including one at a tech startup specifically focused on developing apps to help homeless individuals navigate city services. But as he prepared for these meetings, he found himself grappling with an unexpected dilemma. Success felt possible again, but it also felt complicated. "What if I get back on my feet?" he confided to Joseph during one of their now regular evening conversations. "What if I return to my old life and forget about all this? What if I become one of those people who walks past suffering because it's no longer my problem?" Joseph, who had secured temporary housing through one of the programs Michael had helped him access, smiled with the wisdom of someone who had survived more than his share of hardship. "Brother, you're worried about the wrong thing. You think this experience is something you need to escape from. But what if it's something you were meant to go through so you could help others do the same?" The insight hit Michael like a revelation. His homelessness hadn't been a detour from his real life. It had been preparation for his real purpose. All those years of writing code to solve abstract problems had been training for this, using his skills to solve human problems that actually mattered. At his interview with the tech startup, Michael proposed something that surprised even himself. "Instead of just hiring me as a developer," he said to the founders, "what if we created a program where you hire homeless individuals and provide them with both employment and temporary housing while they transition back to stability? I know dozens of people with skills who just need a chance." The idea resonated immediately. Within a week, Michael found himself not just employed, but leading an innovative pilot program that would become a model for other cities. Anya was hired as a translator and cultural liaison. Joseph became a peer counselor. Even Margaret, despite her age, was brought on as a community connection specialist. But the real transformation wasn't professional, it was spiritual. Michael had begun attending a small downtown church, not because he felt obligated, but because he needed a community that understood what he'd experienced. The pastor, David Martinez, had himself been homeless in his 20s. "Faith isn't believing in God despite your circumstances," Pastor David explained during one of their coffee meetings. "Faith is recognizing God's presence within your circumstances. You didn't need to be rescued from your experience. You needed to be transformed through it." The truth of those words resonated deeply with Michael. Standing in his small but clean apartment, the first stable housing he'd had in 8 months, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Every person he'd met, every act of kindness he'd witnessed, every moment of despair that had been answered by unexpected grace, had been weaving together into something larger than his individual story. Looking out his window at the Toronto skyline, Michael understood that his real journey was just beginning. Homelessness had broken him open, but in the breaking, it had revealed something essential: the interconnectedness of all human suffering and all human hope. "Thank you," he whispered to the evening sky, "for not letting me give up, for showing me that love is always the answer, even when I can't see the question." 6 months after the blizzard that changed everything, Michael's life looked remarkably different from the outside. The homeless transition program he'd helped create was being featured in national media as an innovative solution to urban homelessness. He had a comfortable apartment, a stable income, and recognition as a social entrepreneur. Yet as spring gave way to summer in Toronto, Michael faced his greatest challenge yet: remembering who he was when the cameras weren't rolling. The test came unexpectedly on a warm June evening. Michael was leaving a fundraising gala for the transition program, an event where he'd given a speech to Toronto's wealthy elite about the importance of supporting homeless services. Dressed in his first new suit in over a year, he felt strange in his own skin as he walked through the same downtown streets where he'd once slept. Outside Union Station, he encountered a scene that stopped him cold. A young woman, probably no older than 19, sat with a cardboard sign and a small dog. She looked exhausted, overwhelmed, and achingly familiar. Michael recognized the look in her eyes, the same desperation he'd felt 8 months earlier when his world had collapsed. His first instinct was to help. His second instinct, which shocked him, was to keep walking. He was dressed for success, running late for a meeting with city council members about expanding the program. The contrast between his current appearance and the young woman's situation felt embarrassing, complicated. For a moment, Michael hesitated. The old Michael, the housed, employed Michael, might have dropped some change and kept moving, salving his conscience with a small donation, while avoiding the messy reality of human connection. But the Michael who had been transformed by months on the streets couldn't walk away. "Hi," he said, crouching down to the young woman's level. "I'm Michael. What's your name?" "Sarah," she replied cautiously, pulling her dog closer. "Look, if you're going to tell me to get a job or go home to my parents, just save it. I've heard it all." "I wasn't going to say that," Michael replied gently. "I was going to ask if you're hungry and if you know about the resources available in the city. Because 8 months ago, I was sitting in a spot not far from here, and I wish someone had taken the time to really talk to me." Something in his tone made Sarah look at him more carefully. "You were homeless?" she asked, studying his expensive suit with confusion. Michael sat down beside her on the concrete, not caring about his clothes. "For 8 months, lost my job, couldn't afford rent, ended up on the streets. It was the worst and best thing that ever happened to me." Over the next hour, Michael listened to Sarah's story. She'd aged out of foster care with no family support, worked minimum wage jobs that couldn't cover Toronto's rental prices, and been evicted when she couldn't make rent. Her dog, Charlie, was all the family she had. "The hardest part isn't being hungry," Sarah confided. "It's being invisible. People look right through you, like you're not human anymore." Michael understood completely. He gave Sarah his business card, not to impress her, but because the transition program could help her. But more importantly, he gave her something else: his time, his attention, and the assurance that her life had value. "This program helped me," he explained. "But honestly, what saved me wasn't the job or the apartment. It was learning that I mattered to other people and that other people mattered to me. Everything else grew from there." As they talked, Michael realized he was being presented with a choice. He could treat Sarah as a problem to be solved, connect her with services, and move on with his successful life. Or he could treat her as Pastor David had taught him to see everyone, as a person created in God's image, deserving of love and dignity regardless of her circumstances. "Sarah," he said finally, "I want to help connect you with housing and employment support. But more than that, I want you to know that you're not alone. Can I take you to get something to eat, and we can talk about what comes next?" 3 hours later, Michael finally made it home, having spent the evening helping Sarah navigate intake processes, connecting her with a youth shelter, and ensuring Charlie would be cared for. He'd missed his city council meeting, but he'd gained something far more valuable: the certainty that his transformation was real and lasting. Standing in his apartment, looking at photos from the gala where successful people had celebrated their generosity toward the homeless, Michael felt the weight of responsibility differently than he had before. Success, he realized, wasn't about climbing back to where he'd been before his fall. It was about using every step of his journey, the good and the devastating, to build bridges for others. "Keep me humble," he prayed that night. "Keep me connected to what matters. Don't let success make me forget what I learned on the streets." A week later, Sarah sent him a text from her new job at a coffee shop. "Started work today. Thanks for seeing me as human. It made all the difference." Michael smiled, remembering Margaret's words about grace multiplying. He was beginning to understand that his real calling wasn't to escape his experience of homelessness, but to transform it into a pathway for others to find hope. The boy who had once solved abstract problems with code had become a man who solved real problems with compassion. And in that transformation, he glimpsed the larger purpose that had been guiding his journey all along. As autumn painted Toronto in brilliant oranges and reds, Michael faced a decision that would test everything he'd learned about faith, purpose, and calling. The transition program's success had attracted international attention, and he'd been offered a position with the United Nations to develop similar programs globally. It was the kind of opportunity most people only dreamed of, a chance to impact homelessness on a worldwide scale. Yet as he sat in his apartment, reviewing the UN proposal, Michael felt an unexpected uneasiness. The opportunity was remarkable, but something about it felt disconnected from the intimate, personal transformation he'd experienced on Toronto's streets. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Rosa, the McDonald's manager who had opened her doors during the blizzard. "Michael," she said, her voice tight with worry, "I need your help. The city wants to close down 3 warming centers due to budget cuts. They're saying they need the buildings for other purposes. If this happens, people are going to die when winter comes." The news hit Michael like a physical blow. While he'd been celebrating the program's success and considering global opportunities, the basic safety net that kept people alive was being dismantled. The same system that had nearly cost him his life was about to become even more dangerous for others. That evening, Michael called an emergency meeting at the church where he'd been attending services. Pastor David, Margaret, Joseph, Anya, Sarah, and a dozen other people whose lives had been touched by the transition program gathered in the small community room. "Here's the situation," Michael explained, outlining the city's plans. "We have 6 weeks before the first center closes. If we're going to fight this, we need to do it together." Joseph spoke first. "I spent 12 years on these streets. These warming centers don't just provide shelter, they save lives. The city council members making these decisions have never slept outside in February." Margaret nodded emphatically. "They see numbers on a budget sheet. We see faces of friends who might not survive the winter." As the group discussed strategies, petitions, media campaigns, direct advocacy, Michael found himself thinking about Jesus' words in Matthew 25. "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." The UN opportunity represented a chance to help thousands of people, in theory, but the warming center crisis demanded helping specific people he knew and loved in reality. The choice between global impact and local commitment crystallized something essential about his calling. "I need to tell you all something," Michael said finally. "I've been offered a job with the United Nations. It would mean leaving Toronto, leaving all of you, to work on homelessness internationally." The room fell silent. Pastor David was the first to speak. "That sounds like an incredible opportunity, Michael. What does your heart tell you?" Michael looked around the room at the faces that had become his real family, people who had taught him about resilience, dignity, and unconditional love. "My heart tells me that love isn't abstract. It's specific. It's Margaret sharing her last quarter with a stranger. It's Rosa opening her doors during a storm. It's Sarah finding the courage to trust again. I can't help the world's homeless in general if I'm not willing to help Toronto's homeless in particular." The decision became clear to him in that moment. He would decline the UN position and instead focus on what was directly in front of him, preventing the closure of the warming centers and deepening the work he'd begun with people he actually knew. The campaign to save the warming centers became a 6-week intensive course in grassroots organizing. Michael coordinated media efforts while Joseph shared his story at city council meetings. Margaret and other elderly homeless advocates testified about the life and death importance of these services. Sarah organized younger people to show up at public hearings. But it was Anya who provided the strategy that ultimately won the day. "In my country," she said, "we learned that politicians respond to voters more than to arguments. We need to register everyone we can to vote, and we need to show them that homeless people and their advocates represent real political power." The voter registration drive that followed was unprecedented. Michael and his team registered over 3,000 new voters, many of them people experiencing homelessness or housing instability. When the city council met for the final vote on the warming center closures, the chambers were packed with faces that told the real story of urban poverty. Margaret was among those who spoke that night. "I am 73 years old," she said into the microphone, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I have lived on your streets for 3 years. These warming centers are not budget line items. They are the difference between life and death. We are not asking for charity. We are demanding justice." The vote was close, but the warming centers were saved. More importantly, the campaign had created something that hadn't existed before, a political movement led by homeless people themselves, with Michael and others serving as allies rather than saviors. As winter approached once again, his second winter since becoming homeless, Michael reflected on how different everything felt. A year earlier, he'd been broken by the system's indifference. Now he was part of a community that had learned to protect itself and fight for change. "I think I understand now," he said to Pastor David as they walked through Queen's Park on a crisp November evening. The miracle wasn't being rescued from homelessness. The miracle was being transformed through homelessness into someone who could help others rescue themselves. Pastor David smiled. "That's exactly right. God doesn't typically change our circumstances to fit our comfort. God changes us to meet our circumstances with love." Standing in the same park where he'd once prayed in desperation, Michael felt the presence he'd first encountered during the blizzard, not as a dramatic intervention, but as a quiet certainty that love was always working, even when he couldn't see it. The UN opportunity had been impressive, but this calling was sacred. And in choosing the specific over the general, the local over the global, the people he knew over the people he might help, Michael discovered that his transformation was complete. He was no longer the man who had lost everything. He was the man who had found everything that truly mattered. Winter returned to Toronto with a vengeance, bringing with it the kind of brutal cold that tested every system designed to keep people alive. Michael, now in his second year since experiencing homelessness, thought he understood the rhythms of the streets. But December brought an assignment that challenged everything he believed about his calling and his faith. It started with a phone call from Detective Lisa Wong of the Toronto Police Service. "Michael, we need your help with something unusual. We have a situation at Nathan Phillips Square, a homeless encampment that's been there for 3 weeks. The residents refuse all offers of shelter or services. They'll only speak to you." Michael arrived at City Hall to find a scene that broke his heart. 15 people had created a makeshift community in the square, their tents arranged in a circle around a central fire barrel. Despite temperatures well below freezing, they declined every offer of indoor shelter. The group included several people Michael recognized, including an elderly veteran named Frank, who'd struggled with addiction and mental health issues. "Frank, what's going on?" Michael asked, approaching the central fire where the older man sat bundled in multiple layers of clothing. "There are beds available. Why won't you come inside?" Frank looked up with eyes that held both defiance and despair. "Because inside means rules, Michael. It means being separated from people who've become family. It means having to prove we deserve help every single day. At least out here, we have dignity." As Michael spoke with each member of the encampment, a pattern emerged. These weren't people who had simply fallen through the cracks. They were people who had been broken by the very systems designed to help them. Frank had been assaulted in a shelter. Maria had been separated from her husband due to gender-segregated facilities. David had been banned from services due to his service dog, despite the animal being essential for his PTSD. "The system you helped create is better than what existed before," Frank acknowledged. "But it's still built on the idea that we're problems to be solved rather than people to be loved. Sometimes, dying with dignity feels preferable to living without it." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. Here was the unintended consequence of his success. A system that, while improved, still forced people to choose between survival and self-respect. The transition program had helped many, but it hadn't addressed the fundamental dehumanization that Frank and others experienced daily. Mayor Jennifer Chen, held daily press conferences calling the encampment a public health crisis. Media coverage focused on the disruption to downtown business rather than the reasons for the protest. Public opinion was divided between those who saw the campers as heroes making a statement and those who viewed them as troublemakers refusing help. Michael found himself in an impossible position. The city wanted him to convince the campers to accept services. The campers wanted him to advocate for their right to self-determination. The media wanted him to provide simple answers to complex questions. But as he spent more time with the encampment, he realized that everyone was asking the wrong questions. "This isn't about housing," he told Detective Wong during their daily check-in. "It's about agency. These people have had every decision about their lives made by others for so long that they've forgotten they have the right to choose, even if their choices seem irrational to us." The breakthrough came on Christmas Eve, during the worst storm of the season. Michael had been visiting the encampment daily, not to convince anyone to leave, but simply to listen. As snow fell heavily and winds howled through the square, he made an unexpected decision. "I'm staying tonight," he announced to Frank and the others. "Not to convince you to leave, but because no one should face this storm alone." Frank looked at him with surprise. "You don't have to do this, Michael. You have a warm apartment to go home to. And you have the right to choose where you sleep," Michael replied, setting up a small tent beside the others. "I'm not here to change your mind. I'm here because this is where my friends are." That night, as temperatures dropped to -25°C, something extraordinary happened. City workers arrived with hot coffee and sandwiches, not as part of an official outreach program, but because individual employees had been moved by the sight of Michael choosing solidarity over comfort. Churches in the area opened their doors, not demanding that campers abandon their protest, but offering supplementary warmth and food while respecting their choice to remain. Rosa, the McDonald's manager, showed up with portable heaters powered by extension cords run from nearby businesses. "My grandmother always said that love means standing with people in their darkest moments," she explained, as she helped arrange the heaters around the central fire. By morning, the encampment had been transformed into something unprecedented, a supported, autonomous community. The city had not forced anyone to leave, but had instead created conditions that honored both survival and dignity. Frank approached Michael as he packed up his tent on Christmas morning. "You know what you did last night?" the older man asked, his voice thick with emotion. "You reminded us that we're worth standing with, not just helping. That's the first time anyone in authority has treated us as equals rather than problems." The encampment ended that day, not because anyone was forced to leave, but because the gesture of solidarity had restored something essential: the campers' sense of their own worth and agency. Frank and 3 others accepted transitional housing. Maria and her husband were placed together in couple-friendly accommodation. David was connected with veteran services that welcomed his service dog. But the most significant change was in the city's approach to homelessness services. The Christmas Eve vigil had been covered by national media, sparking conversations about dignity-centered approaches to social services. Michael found himself consulting on policy changes that prioritized choice and self-determination alongside basic needs. "What you did was foolish and beautiful," Pastor David told him during their weekly coffee meeting. "You could have frozen to death out there." Michael smiled, thinking of another cold night when he'd first encountered the presence that had changed everything. "I learned something important that night. Sometimes the most powerful way to help people isn't to solve their problems, but to show them they're not alone in facing those problems." The experience had taught him that his calling wasn't just about creating better services for homeless people. It was about helping society recognize the full humanity of people experiencing homelessness. The difference between charity and justice, he realized, was whether you saw people as problems to be fixed or as partners in creating solutions. Standing in Nathan Phillips Square a week later, where workers were dismantling the last remnants of the camp, Michael reflected on how much had changed since his own first winter on the streets. The boy who had once written code to solve abstract problems had become a man who understood that the most important problems were always human ones, requiring not just technical solutions, but genuine relationship. "Thank you," he whispered to the cold January air, "for teaching me that love isn't just about helping people, it's about honoring their dignity while you help them." Spring arrived in Toronto with unexpected warmth, bringing with it news that would test Michael's faith in ways he never anticipated. The transition program had been so successful that it was being expanded across Canada, with Michael invited to lead the national initiative. It represented validation of everything he'd worked toward, a chance to systematically address homelessness on a scale that could change thousands of lives. But the invitation came with a personal cost that complicated his sense of calling. His grandmother, who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12, was dying of cancer in Vancouver. The doctors gave her weeks, possibly days. She had been his first teacher about faith, about compassion, about seeing God in unexpected places. Michael sat in her hospital room, holding her frail hand while machines beeped rhythmically around them. At 87, she looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, but her eyes still held the warmth and wisdom that had shaped his childhood. "Tell me about your work, sweetheart," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been following the news stories, but I want to hear it from you." Michael shared the journey of the past 2 years, the fall into homelessness, the people who had become family, the gradual understanding that his suffering had been preparation for service. As he spoke, he watched his grandmother's face light up with recognition. "You remember the story I used to tell you about Job?" she asked when he finished. "How he lost everything, but in losing everything, he found something deeper about God's nature." Michael nodded. "You always said that God doesn't cause suffering, but God meets us in our suffering and transforms it into something meaningful. That's exactly what happened to you, isn't it?" she said, squeezing his hand with surprising strength. "You didn't just survive homelessness. You were transformed by it into someone who could transform it for others." They talked for hours about faith, about purpose, about the strange ways that life's greatest trials often became its greatest gifts. As the afternoon sun slanted through the hospital window, his grandmother asked the question that had been weighing on Michael's mind. "What are you going to do about the national program? It's a wonderful opportunity, but I can see in your eyes that you're conflicted about it." Michael had been wrestling with the decision for weeks. Leading the national program would mean leaving Toronto, leaving the specific community that had become his family, leaving the intimate relationships that had taught him everything about love and service. "I keep thinking about Jesus," he said finally. "How he could have stayed in heaven and addressed humanity's problems from a distance, but instead, he came down and lived among us, experienced our struggles firsthand." There's something about staying local, staying connected to specific people and specific places that feels more authentic to me than managing programs from an office in Ottawa. His grandmother smiled with the satisfaction of someone watching a puzzle piece fall into place. "You know what that tells me? It tells me you've learned the difference between success and significance. Success is about achieving goals. Significance is about remaining faithful to your calling, even when bigger opportunities present themselves." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Dr. Sarah Kim entered, looking surprised to see Michael. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were here," she said. "I'm covering for your grandmother's regular oncologist today." She paused, making the connection. "Wait, this is your grandmother? The one who taught you about faith?" As Dr. Kim examined his grandmother, Michael was struck by the strange interconnectedness of it all. The doctor who had treated little Sophia during his first winter homeless was now caring for the woman who had shaped his understanding of compassion. "Your grandson has had quite an impact on our city," Dr. Kim told his grandmother. The work he's done has changed how we think about serving vulnerable populations. After Dr. Kim left, his grandmother turned to Michael with tears in her eyes. Do you see the circle, sweetheart? The little girl you helped led you to the doctor who's now helping me. The compassion you learned on the streets came from seeds I planted in your childhood. Everything is connected. Everything has purpose. That evening, as his grandmother slept peacefully under the influence of pain medication, Michael made his decision. He would decline the national program leadership role and instead recommend Sarah, the young woman he'd met outside Union Station, who had been thriving in the transition program and had shown remarkable leadership abilities. His calling wasn't to manage homelessness programs from a distance. His calling was to remain embedded in the community that had saved him, continuing to learn from people like Frank and Margaret and Joseph, continuing to be surprised by grace in unexpected places. 3 days later, his grandmother passed away peacefully, with Michael holding her hand. Her last words were from the Bible verse that had sustained him during his darkest moments. Whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones will by no means lose their reward. At her funeral in Vancouver, Michael spoke about the woman who had taught him that faith wasn't about having easy answers, but about remaining open to mystery, to surprise, to the ways that God worked through ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Flying back to Toronto, Michael felt the weight of grief, but also the lightness of clarity. He had chosen significance over success, relationship over recognition, faithfulness over fame. The decision felt both difficult and inevitable, costly and liberating. As his plane descended toward Pearson Airport, Michael could see the city spread out below him, the downtown core where he'd first become homeless, the shelter where he'd given up his bed for Anya and Sophia, the square where Frank had taught him about dignity, the streets where Margaret still shared her wisdom with anyone who would listen. Thank you, he whispered, thinking of his grandmother, but also of the larger presence that had been guiding his journey all along, for teaching me that home isn't a place. It's a network of relationships built on love, and thank you for bringing me home. 2 years after Michael's grandmother's passing, Toronto had experienced one of the warmest springs on record. As he walked through Queen's Park on a May morning, Michael reflected on how much had changed, not just in his own life, but in the city's approach to homelessness. The transition program had evolved into something more comprehensive, a community-led initiative that treated housing as a human right rather than a privilege to be earned. The transformation had been gradual but profound. Margaret, now 75, had become the program's elder advisor, her wisdom about survival and dignity informing every policy decision. Frank had been hired as a peer support specialist, his experience with the system's failures making him invaluable in designing solutions. Anya had completed her citizenship training and was working as a translator for newcomer families facing housing crises. But it was Joseph who had surprised everyone the most. The man who had once been ready to die in a doorway had become an ordained minister, serving a small church in Regent Park that specifically welcomed people experiencing homelessness and housing instability. You know what I learned? Joseph had told Michael during his ordination ceremony. I learned that God doesn't waste pain. Every night I spent on the streets, every moment I wanted to give up, was preparing me to meet other people in their darkest places and remind them they're not alone. Michael had been thinking about Joseph's words as he prepared for today's event, the grand opening of Hope Center, a new kind of facility that combined emergency shelter, transitional housing, employment training, and community space under one roof. But more than its services, Hope Center represented a new philosophy that people experiencing homelessness were partners in creating solutions, not just recipients of services. The center had been designed with input from dozens of people who had lived on the streets. Margaret had insisted on a community kitchen where people could cook their own meals with dignity. Frank had advocated for private rooms instead of dormitory-style sleeping areas. Sarah, who now managed the youth services department, had created spaces specifically designed for young people aging out of foster care. As Michael arrived at the center for the opening ceremony, he was greeted by a scene that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier. City council members stood alongside people who were currently homeless, discussing policy changes as equals. Business leaders who had funded the project talked with residents about employment opportunities. Children from local schools presented artwork created in collaboration with shelter residents. Mayor Chen approached Michael with a smile. "You know, when we first met during the encampment crisis, I thought you were just another idealistic activist who didn't understand political realities. I was wrong. You understood something more important than politics. You understood people." The ceremony began with Margaret offering an opening prayer that brought tears to many eyes. "God of love, we thank you for teaching us that home isn't just a building. It's a community of people who see each other as family. Bless this place, not just as shelter from the storm, but as a launching pad for dreams, a place where dignity is never negotiable and where everyone who enters knows they matter." As various speakers shared their stories, Michael found himself remembering the night during the blizzard when he'd first felt the presence that had changed everything. He'd been looking for God in dramatic interventions, in miraculous rescues, in divine solutions to human problems. But God had been present all along, in the ordinary courage of extraordinary people. Rosa spoke about how serving others during the storm had taught her that business success meant nothing if it wasn't paired with human compassion. Dr. Kim shared how treating homeless patients had transformed her understanding of what healing really meant. Detective Wong explained how collaborating with the homeless community had changed police approaches to street-level social problems. When Michael's turn came to speak, he looked out at an audience that included everyone who had shaped his journey. 5 years ago, I was a software engineer who thought problems had technical solutions. I believed that if you could write the right code, you could fix anything. Then I lost my job, my home, my sense of identity. I thought my life was over. He paused, finding Margaret's eyes in the crowd. But what I learned on these streets is that the most important problems aren't technical, they're relational. They can't be solved with code. They can only be solved with connection. The crisis of homelessness isn't ultimately about housing. It's about a society that has forgotten how to see each other as family. Michael's voice grew stronger as he continued. This center represents more than a new building. It represents a new understanding that we're all connected, that everyone has value, that no one should face their darkest moments alone. It represents the truth that grace is always working, even when we can't see it, especially through ordinary people doing extraordinary things. As the ceremony concluded and people toured the new facility, Michael stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The Toronto skyline stretched before him, the same view he'd seen from his lowest moments, but now transformed by everything he'd learned about resilience, community, and love. Sarah joined him on the steps, her own transformation from desperate teenager to youth services manager, a testament to the power of second chances. "You know what's amazing?" she said. 5 years ago, we were all just trying to survive. Now we're helping other people not just survive, but thrive. "That's how grace works," Michael replied, thinking of his grandmother's words. "It doesn't just rescue us from our circumstances, it transforms our circumstances into opportunities to rescue others." As the sun set over Toronto, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, Michael felt a familiar presence, not as a dramatic intervention, but as a quiet certainty that love was always working, always present, always transforming ordinary moments into sacred ones. He thought of the Bible verse that had sustained him through his darkest hours. "And whoever gives one of these little ones even a cup of cold water because he is a disciple, truly I say to you, he will by no means lose his reward." Matthew 10:42. The reward, he now understood, wasn't some future blessing to be earned. The reward was the transformation itself, the way that choosing love over fear, service over self-interest, community over isolation, had changed not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. Standing there in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the sounds of a city that had learned to be more compassionate, Michael whispered one final prayer. "Thank you for teaching me that when hope seems lost, it's often just waiting to be reborn. Thank you for showing me that you're always present in the love we show each other. And thank you for the privilege of being part of your work in the world." As he walked back into Hope Center, where Margaret was teaching a group of children how to set tables for the community dinner, where Frank was counseling a young man who reminded Michael of his former self, where Anya was helping a refugee family navigate their first night in a new country, Michael knew that his real story was just beginning. The man who had once lost everything had found everything that truly mattered. And in finding it, he'd helped create a community where others could make the same discovery. Hope, he realized, wasn't just reborn in his heart. It was multiplying, spreading, transforming everyone it touched. And that, perhaps, was the greatest miracle of all. A message from the heart. If you've made it this far in Michael's journey, something inside you has been stirred. Maybe you see yourself in his struggles. Maybe you recognize someone you know in Margaret's resilience or Anya's courage. Maybe, like me, you're wondering how many people around us are one crisis away from losing everything. Here's what I need you to understand. Michael's story isn't fiction. Right now, as you're watching this, there are thousands of people in cities across the world facing the same impossible choices he faced. The cold is real, the hunger is real, the feeling of being invisible is devastatingly real, but so is the hope. If this story moved you, I need you to do 3 things. First, hit that like button. If you believe everyone deserves dignity, regardless of their circumstances, your like tells YouTube that stories about real human struggle and triumph matter more than viral dances and celebrity gossip. Second, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's a friend going through hard times who needs to remember they're not alone. Maybe it's someone who's forgotten how powerful small acts of kindness can be. When you share this story, you're not just sharing content, you're spreading hope to people who desperately need it. Third, comment below and tell me, have you ever been one act of kindness away from giving up? Have you ever been the person who offered that kindness to someone else? Share your story, because someone reading the comments might be fighting their hardest battle right now and needs to know they're not invisible. Here's what breaks my heart. According to recent statistics, over 35,000 people experience homelessness on any given night in Canada alone. That's 35,000 Michaels, Margarets, and Anyas who are fighting to survive, while the rest of us scroll past their stories. But here's what gives me hope. Every single one of you watching this has the power to be someone's miracle. You don't need money, special skills, or permission. You just need to see people, really see them. And remember that we're all more alike than different. So I'm challenging you. Before this week ends, be intentional about one act of kindness. Buy coffee for the person behind you in line. Smile at someone who looks like they're having a rough day. Volunteer an hour at a local shelter. Text a friend who's been struggling. Then come back and tell us about it in the comments. Let's create a chain of kindness that ripples out far beyond this video. If you want more stories that matter, stories that remind us of our shared humanity and the power of hope, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Because in a world that profits from keeping us divided and distracted, choosing to focus on love and connection is a revolutionary act. Remember Michael's grandmother's words, God doesn't waste pain. Your struggles, your setbacks, your moments of despair, they're not the end of your story. They might just be preparing you to be exactly what someone else needs. One final thought. If you're watching this and you're going through your own winter, whether it's homelessness, job loss, relationship struggles, health challenges, or just that crushing feeling that life is too hard, please know this. You matter. Your life has value. Your story isn't over. And if you need immediate help, I've put resources in the description below. You're not alone. Like if you believe in the power of human kindness, Share if you want to be part of changing someone's story. Comment if you have hope to give or hope to receive. Let's prove that love really can multiply. One view, one like, one share, one comment at a time. Thank you for caring enough to watch until the end. Thank you for believing that stories like Michael's matter. Thank you for being part of the solution. Now go be someone's miracle.